Let's go ahead and get started. Just some housekeeping. I want to welcome everyone. This is our fourth quarter Veritas Financial webinar. We have taken a little bit of a pause earlier this year, but we're excited to get the webinars ramped back up. So thanks for joining us. Appreciate everyone being here. We've got a good mix of existing Veritas clients. I always say lots of prospective Veritas clients and some friends of Veritas. So appreciate everyone being here. Appreciate carving out the time. I know, especially on a Monday, things can be a little chaotic after the weekend. But shockingly, this is when we were able to get Bob to come on. He's a busy guy, as you might imagine, especially here in the middle of election season. For those of you who may not be aware, there's a little bit of an election coming up here in less than a month. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about just a lot of things going on in the economy, in the world, and how these things may impact or not impact the market and the economy and that type of thing. And so what's neat about Bob is I think he lives about 3 miles from our office, but due to the power of technology here, we're able to do this digitally. And but excited to bring him here and share some ideas with you. I'll get to him here in just a second. Want to just go over some quick housekeeping items. Excuse me. Today we're scheduled for 60 minutes. I don't know that we'll take that full amount, but we want to just bring you some relevant topics, some things to think about, some real thought leadership. If you're not familiar with First Trust, and I know those of you who are clients, a lot of you have First Trust in your portfolios. They're just a very, very impressive money manager, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. But lots of great information. Please do ask questions. If you have questions or thoughts, or Bob talks about something and you want clarification, please put that in the chat. Helping me out today, as always, is Danielle Schill. So she'll kind of be behind the scenes fielding those questions. Just a little bit of a nuance. Please try to use the chat as opposed to the Q&A. If you use the chat, then everybody can see the question. If for some reason it's a confidential type of thing, you can put it in the Q&A. Oh, you know what? As I'm saying that, I'm realizing we don't even have Q&A on this, so that makes it easier. Just use the chat. But the other piece of it is if you have specific questions, if you say, hey, Bob talked about this and I'd like to see how that might impact my portfolio, or I'd like to review some of those ideas or think about the other things that we're doing outside of what we're doing with Veritas. Any of that, more than happy to have a conversation. Obviously, that is not the conversation to have in a big group setting via Zoom. And so we'll talk about that offline. Please just reach out to us after the webinar. More than happy to schedule some time to dive in with you individually on any specific questions or concerns that Bob or I, or even Danielle for that matter, can't answer today. As I said before, really excited to have Bob. Bob and I first met a few years ago, spent a little bit of time recently at a First Trust due diligence meeting that was in Nashville. Bob is the Deputy Chief Economist at First Trust Advisors. He's responsible for forecasting the U.S. economy and writing economic commentaries. Excuse me. Now, I just want to pause there for a second. As you might imagine, someone in my profession, at some level, we get barraged by mutual fund companies, exchange-traded fund companies, money managers of all sorts with their ideas about the market, their ideas about the economy. And some of it's good. A lot of it is noise. And I will tell you, there are a handful of these money managers that over the years I have learned to really pay close attention to. Now, admittedly, and Bob's boss is a guy named Brian Westbury, and I really like a lot of his stuff as well. Admittedly, what he says is, look, sometimes we're wrong. But what I like about First Trust is on the rare occasions when they are wrong, they'll say, hey, we missed that one, and here's what we should have seen. But I just really, really like their thought leadership and great ideas and perspective on the market. With Bob's projections, First Trust has won numerous awards for its economic forecast, including being ranked #1 in the world by Consensus Economics for accurately predicting GDP growth and consumer price inflation in the US in 2022. In addition, First Trust is consistently ranked in the top 5 by Bloomberg for forecasting economic indicators. Bob has also won several Crystal Ball Awards from Zillow for forecasting home prices. It's easy to do in Northern Virginia. They just keep going up, right? That's pretty easy. Prior to joining First Trust 18 years ago, Bob was Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department. While there, he was responsible for briefing the Secretary of the Treasury on U.S. macroeconomic developments, formulating policy proposals, and helping generate the official economic forecast used by the president for budget proposals. Day to day, he'd led a team of 20 economists conducting in-depth economic analysis and research. Between 96 and 02, Bob was an economist on Capitol Hill, including the last 2 years as Chief Economist for the Senate Budget Committee. While on Capitol Hill, Bob also worked for the Senate Banking Committee and Joint Economic Committee. Prior to his tenure on Capitol Hill, Bob was an economic journalist for Investors Business Daily. Bob received a BA in economics and government from Georgetown and has been a CFA chartered holder since 2003. So with that, Bob, I'm going to turn it to you. Again, this can be, somewhat informal. So as you do, those of you who are attending, as you have questions, please put those in the chat and we'll get those addressed. But with that, Bob, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Brock. So I'm going to talk about the economy for a little while, then get into politics. I want to preface my comments about politics by saying I am not here to pontificate about what I, Bob Stein, would personally like to see happen a month from today. What I would like to see, or what I'm going to talk about, is what I think will happen instead, what the odds are, whether I like it or not, whether anybody else likes it or not either. In terms of the U.S. economy, I still see some economic trouble ahead. Times are good now, but that doesn't mean they can't get a little worse over the next year or so. When I look at that deep inversion of the yield curve where short-term interest rates are consistently above long-term interest rates, a yield curve that's been inverted for about a year or so, that's likely to remain inverted at least until the early part of next year, I still see some economic headwinds ahead. Now, when I say economic trouble or economic headwinds, doesn't necessarily have to be a recession. I actually think at this point, the odds of a recession over the next 12 to 18 months are below 50%. The odds of a recession, not my base case. But I also think the odds of a recession are higher than the financial markets are currently pricing in. But all of this also begs a question, given that deep inversion of the yield curve, why haven't we hit a major economic problem yet? And in my opinion, it's because last year's federal budget was probably the most reckless budget of our lifetimes. Now, I know it's 2024, it's presidential election year. And so when you comment on public policy, people assume you have some personal political axe to grind. That is not the case here. I spent 8 years defending the budgets under President Obama. I then spent 4 years defending the budgets under President Trump. None of those 12 budgets were the kind of budget I would have written had I been king of the world, but they weren't going to lead the country to wreck or ruin. Last year's budget, though, was different from those others. Back in the 1980s, we had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was consistently criticized by the opposition party, which was then the Democrats, by the media, even by many of his fellow Republicans, for running overly large budget deficits. And yet the largest deficit Reagan ever ran was in 1982, when it was 5.9% of GDP. Last year's deficit, 6.3% of GDP. Even larger than the largest deficit we ever ran under Reagan in the 1980s. But Reagan actually had an excuse. In 1982, the year he ran his largest deficit, the unemployment rate was 10%. The unemployment rate in fiscal 2023 was 3.6%, only roughly 1/3 of where it was 40 years before. And yet the budget deficit was larger than it was 40 years before. But it was actually even worse than what I just told you, and here's why. In the middle of last year, the Supreme Court decided to strike down a large part of President Biden's plan to forgive student loans. Now, that legal decision did not change last year's government cash flow by even a penny. Literally, not a penny. But it did allow the Department of Education to write up the value of its loan portfolio. They could reasonably foresee that more payments would be made in the future on those loans, so they wrote up the value of their loan portfolio. They did so to the tune of 1.2 percentage points of GDP. And due to the nature of government accounting, even though it didn't change the government's cash flow, that 1.2 percentage points of GDP was counted in the official deficit. So were it not for that legal decision, the deficit last year would have been 7.5% of GDP, not 6.3%, dwarfing the largest deficit we ever had under Reagan in the 1980s. And there we were last year with an unemployment rate below 4% and at relative peace. It makes perfect sense to me to run enormous budget deficits when you are bombing the heck out of Japan and Germany, very large deficits during and in the immediate aftermath of the financial panic of 2008 and 2009 or COVID lockdowns. It makes no sense when the unemployment rate is below 4% and the US is at relative peace. But I believe that temporary expansion of the deficit also temporarily masked or hid some of the pain we will eventually feel. Might not be a recession, but some pain we'll eventually feel from the tightening of monetary policy over the past couple of years. This year's deficit, fiscal 2024, which ended last Monday, we'll get the announcement of that in mid-October, later this month, on the exact size of that deficit. It's also going to be enormous, but it's not going to grow. At least the underlying deficit is not going to grow quite as much as last year's. And so I think the chickens are eventually coming home to roost, probably sooner rather than later, on that tightening of monetary policy. Now, in terms of politics, I'm about to throw a ton of numbers your way. Some of you are going to be guessing, where did Bob get these numbers? Where did Bob get these odds on the election? So I'm going to tell you right up front that I made them up. Okay, now I know that's kind of humorous, but it's also completely true. I am not here to regurgitate what anyone can look up by simply looking up the prediction markets online or the odds makers, be they in Dublin or London or Vegas or elsewhere. I'm only here to tell you what I think. It is my subjective opinion as we sit 29 days away from November 5th, Election Day. The only thing I can tell you for sure about my subjective opinion is that it's going to change between now and Election Day. I don't know in which direction. Otherwise, I'd be using those odds today. All I can tell you is the way I see it now. My odds may even change by dinner tonight. All I can tell you is that I really haven't changed my odds much in the past 2 months, or the past month and a half at least. So, but they are likely to change over the remaining 29 days of the race. In terms of the presidential election, here we are again, 29 days away from the election. And at this point, 4 years ago, Joe Biden was ahead by roughly 8 percentage points. And at this point, 8 years ago, Hillary Clinton was ahead by 4 percentage points. And in 2016, Donald Trump, as we all know, went on to win. And in 2020, it ended up very close relative to the Electoral College. So Donald Trump today is behind by around 2.5 percentage points. And when you look at it from that perspective, comparing it to where we were 29 days to go back in 2016 and 2020, I don't think there's any reason for Donald Trump to panic. In the way I look at it, I'm making two assumptions. One is that Donald Trump will probably, not definitely, but probably do better in the actual popular vote than he will in the polls before the election. Number two, he will probably, not definitely, but probably do better in the Electoral College than he will in the popular vote. I combine these effects, and if I were to wake up on the morning of the election before any votes have been counted, and Vice President Harris is ahead in the polls by 3 percentage points, I think it's a toss-up. If she's ahead by more than 3 in the polls, then I think advantage Harris. If she's ahead by less or Donald Trump is ahead, advantage Trump. And here we are 29 days away from the election, still in the afterglow for Vice President Harris of a fine performance in the debate a month ago, and she's ahead by 2.5, not 3. Because of that, I think Donald Trump has a slight advantage, and I think he has about a 60% chance of winning. Now, do not take from this that I'm saying Harris can't win. I think she has a 40% shot. The way to look at it is that if you're an underdog in an NFL game by 2.5 points, okay, you have about a 40% chance of winning. There are teams that are underdogs all the time in the NFL by 2.5 points or much more, and they end up winning. How the heck did Vanderbilt beat Alabama this past weekend? Okay, just because you're an underdog doesn't mean you can't win. And Vice President Harris is certainly not nearly as much of an underdog as Vanderbilt was before they beat Alabama. So I think Donald Trump has about a 60% chance. Doesn't mean Harris can't win, and my odds may change between now and Election Day. In terms of the U.S. Senate, I've taken the liberty of coding every state with a race in it according to whether the current incumbent is a Democrat, in which case it's blue, or a Republican, in which case it's red. Then I divided them up according to whether these races are happening in Democratic states, Republican states, or states in the middle of the political spectrum. And I know we can quibble, maybe Florida belongs here, maybe Minnesota here, but these are basically the 10 states in the middle of the political spectrum for this particular election cycle. And a few things should jump out at you. Number one, there's not one Republican seat that has to be defended in a blue state in this cycle. Not one. There's only one Republican seat that has to be defended in a purple state. That's Rick Scott's seat in the state of Florida. Frankly, he's not going to lose in this cycle. However, there are 3 Democratic seats that have to be defended in Republican states. In the state of West Virginia, the only person who could have saved that seat for the Democrats was the current incumbent, Joe Manchin. He decided not to run. Not for Senate, not for president, not for anything. And that state is almost certainly going for the Republican in this cycle. In addition, the Republicans are likely to take Montana. And even though the prediction markets say it's a toss-up, I think given that Donald Trump chose J.D. Vance, the other Ohio senator, as his running mate, I think that Bernie Moreno, who was otherwise an inferior candidate relative to some other choices in Ohio, will probably be pulled by the top of the ticket, Trump and Vance, into the end zone. In addition, even though the Republicans are underdogs in all the following states, they have a fighting chance in the state of Michigan, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the state of Wisconsin, and even in the deep blue state of Maryland. These 3, most of all. So because of that, right now the Republicans have 49 seats in the U.S. Senate. With West Virginia, it's almost certainly going to 50. My best guess is that the Republicans end up with 52 seats in the U.S. Senate. What do the Democrats have to do to hold on to the Senate? Well, number one, Harris has to win. And then on top of that, after losing West Virginia, they would have to run the table on all the most competitive races in this cycle, all of them. I think the odds of that are only roughly 10%, and so correspondingly so, I think the odds of a Democratic sweep are only 10% as well. By contrast, I think the Republicans have about a 45% chance of a sweep, and there's about a 45% chance of some sort of mixed government over at least the next 2 years. Now, here's the deal. As I've mentioned before, all of these numbers are subject to change between today and Election Day. Here's what's not going to change. My opinion about what happens policy-wise if the Republicans sweep, or if the Democrats sweep, or if we get one of these mixed government scenarios. Whether the Republican odds of a sweep are 45%, or 5%, or 95%, if they sweep, they're going to do the same darn thing. So let's go into the policy implications of what these election outcomes are. In terms of the policy implications, if the Republicans sweep, they will most likely extend and potentially deepen the tax cuts they enacted 7 years ago. Deepening could include a cut in the corporate rate. They already cut that from 35 to 21. They've mentioned going to 15. I think 18 would be a more likely number. In addition, I think given the campaign rhetoric, it'd be very tough for the Republicans not to deliver some extra tax relief for tip income as well. However, as I'll get to in a little while, there's going to be a major scramble for deficit reduction that sets in probably 2 years from now. I think Donald Trump would address that by raising tariffs, reducing green energy subsidies, not getting rid of them completely, just reducing them, and reforming Medicaid as well. I don't think the Republicans, even if they sweep, will have the votes to do anything on Social Security. They will have neither the vote, they will not have the desire to do anything on Medicare. but I do believe they'll have both the votes and the inclination to make significant changes to Medicaid for low-income people around the United States, including a large part of Obamacare. I think they block grants it to the states and let the states experiment with reform and, frankly, squeeze that program over time for budget savings. Another possibility, however, is that if Donald Trump wins and the Republicans take the Senate, there's a possibility that Hakeem Jeffries would become Speaker of the House. And if he does, he will be by far the most powerful Democrat in Washington, D.C. He would fight Donald Trump and the Republicans tooth and nail for everything they want. I think in the end, the tax cut enacted 7 years ago would be extended, but not all of it. I think the Republicans are going to have to compromise and negotiate. What do they compromise on? I think the top rate goes back to 39.6%, where it was for 8 years under Bill Clinton and the last 4 under President Obama. I also think we're likely to see some state and local tax deduction expansion. Right now, it's capped at $10,000. I think it goes to $20,000 to $25,000 instead. In addition, in this scenario, we see increasing tariffs, and there would also be an arcane constitutional battle about something called impoundment. Now, if you haven't heard of impoundment before, don't worry about it. Okay, it hasn't been an issue for 50 years. Basically, many presidents going back to Thomas Jefferson would periodically impound funds. They would recognize that Congress has the power of the purse. Congress would pass a spending bill. The president would sign it. But the president would say, you have the power to hand me a purse with money in it. You can't make me spend all the money in that purse. Many other presidents did so. LBJ did it more during the 1960s because he was trying to save money during Vietnam. And then Dick Nixon gets to the White House in 1969 and does it even more. Because unlike LBJ, Nixon is facing off against a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. And so he's using the power of impoundment strategically to increase his power on other issues, to leverage his power on other issues. So he would cut spending from the districts and the states of people who opposed him on other matters, including Vietnam. In the end, in 1974, weakened by Watergate, Congress passes something called the Budget Control and Impoundment Act. Now, what you need to remember is that it never controlled the federal budget, but it did at least superficially claim to strip both Nixon and all future presidents of the power to impound funds. But it has never been litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court about whether or not the impoundment power is an inherent constitutional authority of the president, in which case Congress can't strip the president of that power by simply passing a law. They would have to pass a constitutional amendment instead. So Donald Trump, in my opinion, is not shy of a courtroom. He would be the president to challenge it. He'd negotiate a budget deal with the Democrats on Capitol Hill, then renege, refuse to spend the money. It would go to the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure which way the Supreme Court would rule, but I think it's entirely possible that the court rules that the president did have this power all along, kind of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And if that happens, both Trump and future presidents would have an additional tool to cut spending. Now, is this going to balance the federal budget? Not even close. Some presidents might save tens of billions of dollars a year. Other presidents might save hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The deficit in the fiscal year that ended Monday or last Monday was roughly $1.9 trillion, trillion with a T. So this is not going to balance the budget, but it could slow the spending trajectory out into the future. In terms of other possibilities, there's the possibility that Vice President Harris wins, in which case she likely, not definitely, but likely faces off against a Republican Senate. And if that happens, this may surprise people given the tone of many of the tax increase proposals coming from her campaign, but I think she does what President Obama did in 2012 and ends up signing an extension of the tax cuts. Okay, now let's go back to 2012. President Obama spends much of that year criticizing the tax cuts originally enacted under George Bush the Younger in 2001 and 2003. He beats Mitt Romney, wins re-election, and a month later, he turns around and cuts a budget deal with the Republicans who run Capitol Hill to fully extend and permanently extend those tax cuts. The one exception being at the very top, the top rate went back to 39.6%, where at that point it had been for 8 years under Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Why would he do that? Why would he reverse himself? Simple. The Republicans jammed him. They said, congratulations on your victory, Mr. President, but if you want to extend these tax cuts for anyone, and the president did want to extend them for people in the lower brackets, then you're going to have to extend them for almost everyone. Otherwise, we're not going to pass a bill, and the American people are going to face a major tax hike going into the 2014 election cycle. President Obama blanked, and the Republicans got most of what they wanted. I think the same thing happens to Vice President Harris because she doesn't want a massive tax increase at the start of the 2026 election cycle. However, this is also the scenario that I think the bond market should be worried about the most, because if I'm right that even Harris ends up at least temporarily extending those tax cuts enacted 7 years ago, there's not simultaneously going to be an increase in tariffs or spending cuts. She's not going to cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or Obamacare or green energy subsidies. In fact, she has additional spending plans that she'd like to see on top of those. So this is a scenario where we have roughly $2.5 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see. One more scenario, unlikely but possible, 10% right now, in my opinion, is a Democratic sweep. And if this happens, I know you've seen horror stories in the press about how high the taxes are going to go. They're not going to go that high. They're going to go up, but not that high. There's not going to be a tax on unrealized capital gains. I'd be shocked if that happens. And why? Because if the Democrats sweep, there are likely to be 50 Democrats only in the U.S. Senate. And that would include John Tester from Montana, who would have had to have won, and Mark Kelly from Arizona, representing all those rich people in Scottsdale. So I think in the end, the Democrats are only capable, and the Harris administration is only capable of raising taxes as much as the 49th and 50th senator on the Democrats is willing to do so. So you're not going to get a tax package that the Squad, for example, is designing, not even close. What do I think would happen? I think the top rate on regular income would go back to that old Bill Clinton, President Obama rate of 39.6%. I think the long-term capital gains and dividend taxes, those rates are now 20%. I know the Medicare on top of it, that's a separate track, but on top of that 20%, I think would go to 24%. I think the estate tax rates would stay the same, but the exemption would go halfway back down to where it was 7 years ago. I think the corporate rate, which was 35 pre-Trump, he cut it to 21, would go halfway back to 28%. And I also think in this scenario, not anybody else is talking about this right now, there is some possibility of introducing a carbon tax into the USA. Now, why do I think this is possible? Hear me out on this theory. 31 and a half years ago, newly minted President Bill Clinton briefly flirted with the idea of imposing a carbon tax. But Bill Clinton could count votes. And when he was thinking about this idea, he also realized that back then, okay, very different from now. Now, it's very rare for Democrats to represent carbon-intensive, resource-rich states. But back then, it happened. Now, not so much. So back then, you had 2 Democratic senators from West Virginia, and 2 from Nebraska, and 2 from Louisiana. Okay, 6 Democratic senators in total, representing carbon-intensive states who would never support a carbon tax. So Bill Clinton counted the votes and realized he couldn't pass it, and so he defaulted to something else instead, including income tax increases and a gas tax increase instead. But next year, even if the Democrats are 50-50, they're not going to have 2 Democratic senators from West Virginia or Louisiana or Nebraska. There's going to be a grand total from those 3 states of 0 instead. So in that scenario, I think it'd be easier for the Democrats to impose a carbon tax. Now, it wouldn't be on households. It wouldn't be on individuals. It'd be corporate side only. And it would start out really, really low because they know that once they get the camel's nose under the tent, in future decades with other Democratic presidents, they might be able to raise it further. The key part is getting it into the code in the first place. Now, there is an obstacle. John Fetterman and Bob Casey, both Democrats from the state of Pennsylvania, which is very intensive in natural gas production. But I think they've both made noises about wanting to do something on climate change. And so I think Pennsylvania could be bought. They'll make a sweetheart deal for Pennsylvania, and that will happen with the carbon tax. One more thing I'd like to talk about of substance before I get to your questions. That's the national debt. I hear over and over again, the national debt is $35 trillion. So people are worried if the U.S. is eventually going to go bankrupt, unable to pay our bills. And my answer to this has always been no. You know, we're not turning into Argentina. And it's still no, we're not turning into Argentina. But my answer is a little more nuanced than it used to be. So please bear with me. I actually think it's a bad idea to look at the top line number on the debt. The best way to look at the debt is to look at the interest cost on the debt relative to GDP. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was consistently about 3% of GDP. Then a bunch of good stuff happened. And we were at like 1.5% of GDP for about 20 plus years. I call this period back here the age of candy. Why was it the age of candy? Because we cut taxes in 2001, 2003, and 2017. In 2004, we added a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. In 2010, we had the first major expansion of entitlements since the 1960s under President Obama with Obamacare. And ever since then, there's been a contingent of Democrats calling for Medicare for all. Why did all this happen? In my opinion, it's because when the interest burden is low, politicians realize they have a lot of money lying around to buy our votes. And that's exactly what they did. But the age of candy is finally coming to an end. In the last fiscal year, 2023, where we have official data, it's 2.4%. When all is said and done on the fiscal year that just ended last Monday, I think it's going to be roughly 3% instead, back where we were in the 80s and 90s. Here's the good news. I do not believe that the interest burden skyrockets to outer space at 4 to 5% of GDP. I do not think that's going to happen. But the reason I don't think it's happening is something unpleasant, which is I think we go back to something that I like to call the politics of limits. Okay? Politics of limits is what we had from 1982, not 1981, 1982 to 1998. What happened during that time frame? Well, Mr. Tax Cut himself, Ronald Reagan, in 1982 signed a bipartisan deal to raise the payroll tax on all American workers combined. And in the mid-1980s, we had something some of you may remember called Gramm-Rudman-Hollings, designed to slow the growth of federal spending. And in 1990, George Bush, the elder, goes out to Andrews Air Force Base, cuts a budget deal with the Democrats who run Capitol Hill to renege on his no new taxes pledge, raise taxes a little bit, and set strict spending caps on both social and military spending alike. And then in 1993, Bill Clinton comes to town, raises taxes more, just not the carbon tax, and decides to keep those strict spending caps in place that he had criticized throughout the 1992 campaign that he inherited from George Bush the elder. And those spending caps held until 1998. That's the politics of limits, both partisan and bipartisan measures to control the budget deficit. That's what I think we're going back to. But here's the problem, folks. This happy time back in the late 1990s, following decade, okay, my marker seems to have run out. This period back here is never coming back now that it's gone. We are not going back to the age of candy. Why did we get a reduced interest expense? Well, we had the baby boom generation hitting their peak earning years. We had Social Security and Medicare, a smaller part of the federal budget. And we had a peace dividend left over from winning the Cold War. What do we got now? We've got the baby boom generation hitting the beach and the golf course, not their peak earning years. Social Security and Medicare, a larger and growing share of GDP. And we have China and Iran and North Korea preparing for war. Now, knock wood, there are no wars, especially not involving the USA. But if we want to prevent the wars of the future, we darn well better get prepared for the wars of the future. That means a whole heck of a lot more military and national defense spending over the next few decades compared to the age of candy. The age of candy is coming to an end. It is going to be the politics of limits as far as the eye can see. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd be delighted to go over the questions right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. And yeah, if anybody has questions, I'll dive in, but would love to hear from those of you on today's call. If you have questions, let us know. I'd love to maybe even flesh out that last point a little bit. Obviously, a lot's happened in the last week, even with regard to things going on in the Middle East, and you mentioned Asia, and certainly what's going on in Eastern Europe. A lot of stuff happening, not just on U.S. soil. And any thoughts about the impact to the economy with regard to what might happen there?
So the only thing I'm really worried about for the U.S. economy is if China decides to invade Taiwan, it's going to be brutal for about 6 to 9 months. The reason being that the world is still highly dependent on semiconductor production in Taiwan itself. It's becoming less so because they've been preparing for something like this. I also think that the risk of China invading Taiwan is substantially below 50%. It's not my base case, but I think the risk is going to be higher over the next 5 years than the last 5 years. And so it's something to be concerned about. Um, uh, it would be worrisome. I'm not as much worried about the impact on the conflict, the current conflict in Eastern Europe between Russia and Ukraine. I do think in the short term, there is also a risk with energy because I think Israel has put itself in the position that it is more able and willing to attack Iran directly than it has ever been before. Let's remember that Israel was responsible roughly 40 years ago or so for knocking out the early nuclear ambitions of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And they were responsible, I think it was around 15 years or so ago, for knocking out uh, Assad's nuclear ambitions in Syria. They did this supposedly unilaterally, and I would not be surprised if there is a major attack on Iran um, sometime soon, including both its nuclear facilities, oil fields, and, in my personal opinion, hopefully the mullahs themselves. Again, I don't like to do much commentary, but when I talk about Iran, it gets my blood boiling. So sorry about that. So that may happen. Now, you have to remember, if this had happened 30 years ago, or pre-fracking revolution in the U.S. and horizontal drilling in the U.S., really, um, this would be a danger for the U.S. because if oil prices temporarily spike, well, we're a huge net petroleum importer back then. We are now no longer really a net petroleum importer. We're roughly imbalanced, slight exporter, if you include the refined product. So, a big price increase for oil is not as much of a danger to the U.S. economy as it previously would have been. It's much more of a danger to, say, certain sections in Europe and the Japanese economy, as well as um, China. So those countries are much more dependent on imports of oil than the United States is. We really are net independent of petroleum at this point. So a price increase just redistributes within the United States where the economic growth is from the resource dependent states toward the states that are resource producers.
Got it. Thank you. I see that Jay Colligan has a question. I think Danielle's
Bob,
going to unmute.
thanks.
There you go, Jay.
Thanks for all of this, Bob. This is fantastic. I'm on Brock's team here at Veritas. And going back to the Chinese for a minute, what is keeping them? What's stopping them from taking Taiwan? They've been rattling that saber. They wanted it for 60 years. What do you think is still stopping?
Well, when you march off to seize Vienna, you damn well better have confidence you'll be able to do it successfully. I mean, look what's happened in Russia because they were not able to quickly achieve their military goals. And so I think there's a possibility that with Chairman Xi in China, he's concerned that, well, maybe it wouldn't be as successful. He's not sure what the U.S. response would be. Are we going to pay China on the debt we owe them? It's less now than it used to be because China has been preparing for this. Are we going to use financial sanctions on China? Are we going to substantially ramp up tariffs and other types of trade sanctions on China following an invasion? What type of military commitment would the United States make in response to an invasion? Could the Chinese by themselves, after taking the beaches in Taiwan, easily move forward? And what is the cost of a longer duration military venture than they had planned for in terms of the political viability of both Chairman Xi and the Communist Party of China? It's be a major undertaking, not easily done or and not haphazardly taken. China doesn't, communist China really doesn't have, since Korea and some skirmishes related to Vietnam, including after the Vietnam War, doesn't have a long history of mass invasion. Again, Korea is a long time ago, of a different location outside the country. So it remains to be seen whether they have confidence in pulling it off.
Hey, Bob, something you didn't talk about today, but I have heard you talk about in the past. There's a lot of speculation that the U.S. may lose its status as reserve currency. I know now it's close to 60% of the world's currency. Do you think that's going to happen, and what might be the impact there?
So I think I'll be long dead and buried before we lose our reserve currency status, and my children will probably be as well. I don't see it happening anytime soon for this reason. Um, uh, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Well, the US dollar is the one-eyed currency. Okay, we don't have to be a perfect currency or even close. We just have to be the best out there. There is a currency that could take our place. It consistently rises in value relative to the dollar decade after decade, and that's the Swiss franc. The problem is that if you're going to be a reserve currency country, you have to have your government issuing enough debt so that foreign central banks can purchase that debt and use them to back up their own currencies. Well, I'm exaggerating a little, but the national debt of Switzerland is worth like 8 francs. Okay, so there's just not enough Swiss debt to go around. I mean, they've had negative interest rates because there's so little debt. So there's not enough Swiss franc issued debt in order to pull it off. And I don't think China is going to take our place. People don't trust the government of China. And anytime there's a financial crisis, periodically every 15 years or so, there's going to be a worry about the breakup of the Eurozone. So I really don't see anybody to take our place. In other words, a currency with two eyes that's big enough to take our place.
Bob, thank you again. Really appreciate all of your thoughts, and the resources that First Trust continues to provide just are great. And so, a unique organization in the wealth management space. So thank you for that. Also want to remind folks that we are trying to do these on a quarterly basis. And so Bob mentioned a little bit about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And on January 23rd is our next quarterly webinar, and we'll be talking about that in detail. We've got Clint Thomas, who's a local CPA, who will be joining us talking about that specific topic. And, that'll be an interesting day as well, because we'll be 3 days into the new presidency of one of these candidates. So look forward to that. As always, if anybody has questions, if you need anything, if you have things that you want to follow up on with regard to what Bob talked about or otherwise, please just let us know. But otherwise, Bob, thank you again. And Danielle, thanks for your help behind the scenes. And hope everybody has a great week. Look forward to seeing all of you very soon. Take care.